Okay, hello everyone. Hope you all can hear me. We think some people might have been affected by the Zoom outage earlier today, so hopefully some more people might join us as we go through the session. Thank you very much for joining us here on our multiple capitals webinar. This is the second multiple capitals webinar that we've done. The previous one focused on our first stage of our multiple capitals work. I think it was around a year or so ago. So welcome. We will just start. I'll just start by. Oh, I can't get that to change. Just before we forget to let you know that if you would like to ask any questions throughout the webinar, please use the Q&A button rather than the chat. If you can tell us your name and which organisation you represent when you do that, so that we know who to attribute the questions to and who to respond to, particularly if we need to respond later. We will respond to as many as we can during the session today, but if we can't, we will get back to you at a later date with the answers. We will be leaving questions to the end though, so that we can look at maybe if more than one person's asked the same thing, so that we can group them and give time at the end there to address them all properly. So my name's Lorraine Wall. I'm the Head of Planning and Policy at Friends of the Lake District, and I'm joined today by Dr. Lois Mansfield from Environmentos, who's also going to be presenting. And Dr. Jan Darrell, also from Friends of the Lake District. She manages our land and is in our policy team. Christian Lisman is on hand as well with any tech support. And I know that we have our colleague Amanda McCleary as well. She's our policy officer who deals with farming, agriculture and common land, for example. So just before we get going into the multiple capital side of things, just wanted to give you a bit of a background in case you're not familiar with our organisation, a bit of background about us as a charity. We're an independent charity and membership organisation with over 6,000 members and a wider supporter base. Beyond that, people can be members of Friends of the Lake District, but they support us in a range of other ways as well, whether that's through donating to our fundraising appeals, right through to helping us do repair work on our land, for example, or indeed in the office as well, which is really helpful, particularly throughout the winter, packing at our Christmas merchandise. We're a landscape charity. We do operate across the whole of Cumbria despite our name. So we have a vision for thriving Cumbrian landscapes for nature, for people, forever. And we strive to fulfill this vision by campaigning. So we do what we call big and little C campaigning. The small C stuff is the behind the scenes, responding to consultations, for example, to influence local or national planning policy or land management policy and legislation, right through to the big C stuff, which is the more public facing side of things. It can be anything from holding a rally to challenge a particular development proposal that's of concern from a landscape perspective, right through to sort of lobbying MPs for that similar kinds of policy and land legislation change. We also inspire and mobilise others to work with us in partnership to do all these things. And we hope to lead by example too. We own or manage 12 pieces of land across Cumbria. And two of those are the ones that are in question here when we're talking about multiple capitals, because we've used our land to trial this multiple capitals work. So we lead by example by doing that, and we've done lots of other work on our land to do that as well. For example, by looking at different methods to ensure that our land is resilient to climate change and different new techniques to do that. So I say we are a Cumbrian landscape charity, even though we're called Friends of the Lake District. Just to clarify, that's because although we're an independent charity, we are in effect the Cumbria branch of the Campaign to Protect Rural England, or now known as CPRE, the landscape charity. So they're the national organisation. We're effectively a Cumbria branch, but an independent charity as well. So the purpose of this webinar really is to give you, if you've been engaged in our multiple capitals work before, whether you were at that webinar on the first trial of the work a year or so ago, it's a reminder of that work that we've done to date, or if you aren't aware of it, we can set that context for you. So it's a chance to learn more about this innovative methodology, this first of its kind work, to provide an update since that first trial experimental assessment that we did on our land at Little Asby Common. It's to explain that further testing and development that we've done of the methodology as we've moved it on to the Howes Wood example. And to hopefully open a discussion really around the issues that are faced by people doing various types of capitals assessments, to see if those are shared with others, and to hopefully see if there's any ideas for ironing out some of those issues. And we also wanted to bring people together to issue really a call for ideas, feedback, action, and support, enabling a wider testing of this methodology, further developing the methodology, and hopefully, once we've refined it further, to roll it out to make it a more commonly used approach. Our work on multiple capitals so far, Lois will probably go into some of the finer detail about this shortly. But in terms of us as Friends of the Lake District, we wanted to do this work because, of course, landscape is multifaceted. It's everything. And so many of the capitals assessments we'd seen had simply failed to take account of the full value of landscapes, of habitats. We're essentially, as an organisation, in principle against the quantification and monetarisation of landscapes, but we knew that essentially that is the direction in many ways that the assessment of the value of landscapes is going, of habitats as well. So we thought we should engage with the process and decided to conduct a natural capitals assessment of one of our pieces of land. It was then that it really did become apparent that that kind of assessment that focuses just on natural capital really did fail to recognise the true value of our sites. And, for example, cultural heritage value and social values, the benefits that pieces of land, pieces of different types of habitats bring, simply aren't taken into account in some of those natural capitals and other types of single focus assessments. So we decided to try and explore ways of addressing this issue, this missing out of some of those really important benefits that pieces of land can bring us. And we commissioned Dr. Lois Mansfield of Environmentors to develop this methodology for a multiple capitals assessment to look at every benefit of our site at Little Asby Common. And that work, again, Lois will go into more detail shortly, but that calculated the net present value of Little Asby Common to be 28.1 million when taking all those different benefits and values of that site into account. Nevertheless, as we tested and trialled this methodology, this multiple capitals assessment approach, it was clear that the methodology needed some further development, and we wanted to test it on a different piece of land to see how, if there was similar results coming out, if the methodology could be applied differently in a different circumstance, and whether the same issues were arising, and to give us some lessons and ideas as to different ways it could be applied, different ways that perhaps we could refine and amend the methodology to iron some of those issues out. So we refined and reran the methodology on a totally different site in a different part of Cumbria. Little Asby was in the east of the county, in high up common land, in the Yorkshire Dales National Park, although the part that is within Cumbria. And this was Howes Wood, southwest of the county. This one's woodland, just in a very different context. So we wanted to, when we'd run this second round of the multiple capitals assessment, we realised that there were some of the same issues that were coming out, and we were also becoming aware that other approaches to developing multiple capitals assessments were facing similar issues. So essentially we felt that this second webinar would be really helpful to bring together relevant and interested parties to discuss some of these issues and hopefully start to shine lights on how they could be dealt with, as well as I mentioned before, hopefully bringing it to the fore in more people's minds, making people aware that this approach of multiple capitals assessments rather than just the single focus assessments is developing, and hopefully to develop it further by doing so. I'll just give you now a bit of a context about Housewood before I then hand over to Lois to give you that more detailed information about the actual methodology itself and how we've applied it. So Housewood, Upper Eskdale Valley in the southwest of Cumbria, southwest of the Lake District National Park. It's about 8 hectares, very much a woodland in that wider valley setting. Semi-natural ancient woodland in part, but also some ancient replanted woodland. It was a coppice serving local bobbin mills once upon a time and supplying bark for the tanning industry, for example. And there's still some of the cultural heritage aspects of that left in and around the site. The site was acquired by the Forestry Commission in the 60s and it was reforested. It had been left unforested at the time. And it was then another 20 years before Friends of the Lake District acquired the site and we cleared the conifers to allow the woodland restoration for us to do the woodland restoration. And we also restored boundaries, mainly dry stone walls. But we've also enabled some low-level public access as well, installing some bridges where they were needed, and a viewing platform. There's some really great views from the site into the wider Eskdale Valley. And we manage it now for fairly low-level recreational access, the footpaths within the site linked to other parts of the valley. And we've really increased the biodiversity there quite substantially. We've had regular assessments of the biodiversity on the site, and it's really shown a dramatic increase under our stewardship. I'll hand over to Lois now to go into that more detail about the multiple capitals assessment approach.
Thanks, Lorraine. We're just switching a share function. I'd just like to take the opportunity to thank Friends for sticking with me with this to develop the methodology. Okay, so just to remind people what a multiple capitals account is, it's basically a process to identify and value all characteristics and benefits that a landscape has for society. And I'm sure lots of people on the call are familiar with natural capital, but what we try to do with a multiple capitals account is to push it and to include everything that we get from a landscape. So I was interested in understanding the value, the total value of rural landscapes. So I'll apologise for those of you that are interested in urban landscapes and other sorts of landscape. So along with natural capital, there's human capital, and the sorts of things that I was interested in looking at were the labour from the volunteers and from any wage staff, understanding knowledge and the value of knowledge and different types of skills. Thirdly, we're interested in social capital, which is, as you know, it's the glue that holds society together, as they say. So it was more about how people work collectively and the benefits that people get from working collectively, but also issues such as sense of place, educational visits, access, and so on. Then a big chunk was cultural capital, which is an interesting thing in itself. And I know there's been a big project going on with the government in relation to DCMS, in relation to understanding more about cultural capital. So I learned some really useful things from there that we could pull through on this particular exercise. So cultural capital is about landscape aesthetics, traditional practices and heritage. And then finally, we also pulled through things about financial capital as well. Thinking about grants that may have been used, local multiplier effects in relation to businesses, and the value that the wood brings to the wider local economy. So the idea is to think about all those different 5 areas. So basically the process, for those of you that are perhaps not familiar with it or haven't seen the previous webinar, the idea is that you start by quantifying through, excuse me a moment. Go, because I'm on lorry. Sorry, I beg your pardon, the plumber's just turned up. Life, eh? So the first stage of the methodology was to quantify through inventory and evaluation each components of the landscape. So here's a rough list of the sorts of things that I was interested in inventorying and giving it some sort of quantification and then evaluating its condition. And therefore that then allowed me to think about how we could actually put some sort of financial value on each of these inventories and attributes. So the 3 ways of doing this that are generally accepted. The first 2 direct market value. So that's how much things you would pay for, which is pretty straightforward. The second one is known as benefits transfer. And benefits transfer is about using figures that are previously devised from other studies that have been pulled forward and can be used in a new study. So that's what benefits transfer are. So you get figures for different parts of your inventory that you can just pull through. And then if you haven't got direct market value or benefits transfer, what you can use is something called willingness to pay. And I'll talk about willingness to pay later, because lots of people do have issues with it as a process. But basically, it's how much someone is willing to pay in pounds or dollars or whatever it is to pay for X or Y, depending what X or Y might be, say dark skies or tranquility or whatever. So the idea is that to try and use as many direct market value valuations or benefits transfers, and use willingness to pay as little as possible, because it's a much more subjective method, and that's where people tend to have an issue with it. So what you do is that you use the different accounting tools to work out how much each aspect or each attribute of the landscape is worth. You then sum them up by capital type, so all the different human capital issues, all the different cultural issues, and you sum it up, and then you come to a financial figure, an overall financial figure for the whole site. So that was the rough process that we did, and there's a lot more detail about the process and the methodology in the report that can be seen on the Friends website. So Little Asby Common, which was the first thing that we did, this is to give you a rough idea of the sorts of net present values that we got for Little Asby Common. So you can see the first thing is that the jumps out is that cultural capital actually generated far more value than everything else put together. And that in itself was interesting. Most of those cultural capital things were measured through willingness to pay. And this is one of the issues that people tend to have with this methodology in relation to willingness to pay, is because it's quite subjective, and it's based on people's opinions. And as we all know, people's opinions vary tremendously. So some people may value one thing much more greatly than another, which is why a benefits transfer or a direct market valuation approach is much more objective to use. But anyway, it gives you a general idea of the sorts of results that we generated for Little Asby Common. We talked to a number of organisations, a number of people that were interested in multiple capitals, and there were various issues that came up in relation to the methodology, which allowed us to move into our second pilot to try and address some of the other things that people were interested in understanding in relation to a multiple capitals account. And first of all, people were interested in applying different tools from natural capital accounting. So the idea of stocks and flows, which isn't common in multiple capitals, and I'll talk about that in a minute, and to also look at what's called a 50-year discounting model. So that's extrapolating into the future how much a site will generate. And these tools, stocks and flows and discounting, have been used for natural capital accounts, but obviously they haven't been used for a multiple capitals account because nobody's done it until now. And then the other issues were the use of willingness to pay, because it's subjective, to try and reduce the reliance on this technique by pulling forward other benefits transfer processes or other information in relation to direct market value. And because the Little Asby Common study was done, well, it started 3 years ago, hopefully the idea was that we'd be able to replace some of the willingness to pay methodology with new techniques and new tools to value different types of landscape attribute. There are also issues about how many people you need in order to do a good willingness to pay survey. The threshold is 300 respondents, and it is an issue in relation to willingness to pay, and how do we think about that, and how could we address that was another issue. And then finally, there's the whole issue of double counting, trying to have an aspect, the landscape aspect, that you might double count in your maths, basically in your counting model, twice by accident. And I'll explain more about that in a moment. So there are some different things that we wanted to explore to try and move the methodology on. So the first thing is to apply stocks and flows. Okay, so stocks and flows are concepts which are developed from the field of natural capitals. These are terms that are not really applied in other capital types of capital work. So you won't see it in human capital, you don't see it in social capital. So they're terms that are very much developed through the natural capital literature since the 1990s. And we were challenged to see if we could move these ideas of stocks and flows and actually apply them to multiple capitals. So if you're not familiar with the ideas of stock and flow, stock is basically a collective term for the fundamental building blocks of the environment, which make up natural capital. So these are the things that most of us can get our head around, things like geology, soils and biodiversity. And flows are the benefits, goods and services from society produced by stocks. Now, in relation to natural capital, the easiest example that I'm sure we're all familiar with now are ecosystem services for natural capital. So there was a sort of a structure, conceptual structure that could be followed. And, you know, I have to say that nobody's done this. So this is my first attempt at it. So sorry, there's a lot of information to take in, but again, the slides will be made available after the presentation. So we've got a good idea in relation to natural capital. So the idea was to try and look at stocks and flows in relation to the other types of capital: human, social, cultural, and financial. So this was my first stab attempt. Pulling in particular in cultural capital was useful because of the work that's being done by DCMS and the research that's coming out. It was enabling me to pull things through from where they were beginning to think about stocks and flows. But other areas, it hasn't been done. So I was doing quite a lot of kite flying, a lot of reading, trying to understand where the different literatures were in relation to social capital and so on, and human capital, and how we could divide them between stocks, the building blocks, and then the benefits that we get from those building blocks. So as I say, this is a first attempt. So if anybody's got any ideas, I'd love to hear. We can talk about it at the end. So once we've got stocks and flows, the idea was then to try and divide up the different capitals into stocks and flows for Housewood and then also for Little Asby. So you can see here the first two pies show the overall value of stocks for Housewood, which was 1.5 million. So this is net present value. So that's what things are worth at the moment. And the flows were worth 778,000. Okay, and you can see once again, cultural capital has the lion's share of both stocks and flows. And that in itself is interesting yet again. If we compare it to Little Asby Common, so I retro-engineered these ideas back onto the work that I'd done for Little Asby Common. You can see the stocks at the top and the flows at the bottom. And once again, cultural capital is quite dominant, followed by natural capital in relation to stocks, and then flows, you can see again, very dominant by cultural capital, followed by financial capital, and then human capital. And so therefore, it's an interesting exercise in looking at stocks and flows and how much things can be summed, what the accounts are showing. If you want to see the breakdown of all the detail of what's included in stocks and flows and how the maths all works, again, you can look in the report for Friends of the Lake District on their website. So the second thing that we were interested in looking at is this idea of discounting. And for those of you that aren't familiar with it, who aren't really embedded in natural capital accounting, it's basically a technique which extrapolates, so it sort of future forecasts the value of goods and services over a set time span, and the idea of what society attaches to the present as opposed to the future. And there are different rates of discounting that are applied. HM Treasury suggests that you use a devaluation in year one of 3.5% for each year. So the value you work out in year one, in year two, it's worth 3.5% less. And then year three, it's worth 7% less, and so on and so forth. And then they have another value for health benefits, which they think are 1.5%. So year one would be 1.5% less in year two, and then it would be 3% less in year three, and so on and so forth. So you can actually work out cumulatively over 50 years how much things are worth. Now, the thing with discounting is it doesn't account for the phenomena of inflation. And things like salaries and grants, and hopefully for grants, is that the rate at which people are paid for grants or salaries should go up year on year. So I built in a 2% inflation rate to see what would happen when we worked out the discounting. So the present values from the multiple capital account from the last slide, we pulled through and were discounted over 50 years to determine the total cumulative value for each site would provide for society by 2075. So this is what happened for Little Asby Common. So I retro-engineered the Little Asby Common results through a 50-year discounting model. And it came to demonstrated that after 50 years, the amount of multiple capitals generated by Little Asby Common is a mind-blowing £733 million, which is quite a lot. And that's divided roughly into 1/3 for stocks and 2/3 for flows. And then I did the same for House Wood, and that came out at a 50-year value of 58.5 million, of which 32 million was stocks and 26 million was flows. So we're able to demonstrate basically how much these sites will generate for society over a 50-year period. So again, that's interesting in itself, and there's all sorts of detail and discussion that can be had about those figures and what they do or don't mean. The third thing that we looked at was this horror of willingness to pay, because from an academic point of view, it's a subjective technique and it has many acknowledged flaws. But if you go into the process with your eyes open, understanding where those weaknesses are, it does at least give you an idea of how much people are willing to pay for things that perhaps are a bit more esoteric, things like sense of place or tranquility or dark skies, or things that we currently don't have another methodology to value. So 3 things that we were interested in. First of all, figures with willingness to pay are often are explicit to the site in question. So you do a survey, you ask people what they think, and they give you some information, and then you pull the data, and then you come up with average figures. However, what we found is by doing statistical analysis between Little Asby Common and House Wood, there wasn't actually any statistical difference between the 2 sets of values. So the idea that willingness to pay is only linked to the site in question, it hasn't happened this time. And I'm not sure why, and it's something that needs further explanation. And whether it's just an inherent system in relation to landscape valuation and multiple capital valuation, or whether there's something deeper going on, I can't answer that question at this point. But it does suggest that people are valuing things like dark skies and tranquility in very similar ways and with some similar financial values, irrespective of location. But that's only a suggestion, and then obviously we need to test that idea more to find out whether that is a truism. The second thing that many researchers try to avoid using willingness to pay, and they try and find more objective tools instead. So ideas like benefits transfer, bringing in ideas from other disciplines and other areas. And despite searching the literature, databases, contacting people and organisations, we still struggled to replace many of the willingness to pay landscape attributes to ways we value different parts of the landscape, such as dark skies and tranquility. We couldn't find replacement methodologies, tools to put into the system to actually try and eliminate as much willingness to pay as possible. So again, if you can help us, I'd be delighted to know, because I too want to reduce the willingness to pay reliance, because I know it is subjective and people do have an issue with it. And then the third issue we have with willingness to pay is that generally, if you read the academic literature, it goes on about you need to have 300 respondents to actually make the figures a truism have value, to actually where you actually they're giving you a pretty good approximation of what people are thinking and what their value is. We didn't achieve that 300 this time either. Last time we managed 244 people. This time we had even less people answer our survey, which made me quite nervous. But I thought, no, we'll still go through the process. And you can see from number 1, the figures that generated are often explicit to site. It didn't actually happen, even though there was a difference of 100 people within the data set, the actual data that we had. The other thing that was interesting is that there was no difference, there was no bias between Friends of the Lake District membership, who we encouraged to do the survey, and people who weren't members of Friends of the Lake District. There wasn't much difference in their willingness to pay for different aspects of the landscape. And that in itself is really interesting, is that it makes no difference whether you're a member of this particular organisation or not. However, I will argue that as a geographer, my background is obviously in geography, it's in sampling and what's a representative sample in relation to a population. And there's quite a lot of literature that suggests a sample size of between 150 and 200 can be as reliable as 300. And it's based on the relationship between something called standard errors and sample size, which again, if you're interested in my rationale behind that, you can look at the report that I produced for Friends of the Lake District. So I was quite comfortable that we managed to get 134 in the second survey and 244 in the first survey, and I was quite comfortable with the fact that the willingness to pay, it didn't hit the 300, but it actually gave me quite a good confidence in what the data were telling us. And then the last issue that everybody talks about is double accounting or double counting. It refers to the way in which various phenomena can be fiscally counted for more than one part of a accounting process. And this issue is particularly problematic in relation to natural capital accounting, and this is what worries people. So if I've got an example here. We can calculate and include monetary values of ecology, landscape aesthetic, and practical management skills of a hedge separately. So we could go out and we could ask people, how much would you value the ecological value of a hedge, the landscape aesthetic value, the practical management skills of a hedge, and reproducing and restoring a hedge. And what would happen then is that in the natural capital account, the value of the hedge would appear 3 times in the natural capital account, and that's what's known as double accounting. So you're putting figures in 3 times instead of just saying it's one hedge, and therefore we should just value that hedge once and not 3 times. So I would argue that double counting is not an issue for multiple capitals accounting. I know it's an issue for natural capital accounting, but I don't actually think it is for multiple capitals accounting, because basically we are interested in the multiple values that a phenomenon like a hedge actually has for society. And I think the ability to think about the values, the different financial values of a hedge, for instance, in different ways is actually important, because it's actually telling us something about the importance of its landscape aesthetic value, its ecological value, its practical management skills value. And different people are also interested in different things. So somebody might only be interested in its ecological value and therefore neglect to think about its landscape aesthetic or its practical management skills, the skills that people learn from hedge laying and from maintaining hedges, and the value that brings to society. So I think a multiple capitals account actually doesn't have the issue of double counting. And I really do stand by that, because I think there are several reasons for that. First of all, is a natural capital account and a multiple capital account are conceptually related, but they're aiming to two very different jobs. Secondly, I think natural capital accounting suffers from what I call capital appropriation. And I know this upsets quite a lot of people, because a multiple capital account explicitly recognises individual capital components which constitute the wall or the hedge or whatever it happens to be. Thirdly, I think that in accounting for multiple capitals embedded in a landscape attribute, the full value of the tribute is recognised. So we're not just looking at it from one point of view, we're looking at it from multiple points of view. And a hedge is really important for different things. A wall is important for different points of view and different perspectives. And it brings a multitude of values for society. So I think, again, this idea of double counting isn't an issue in multiple capital accounting. And then finally, I think by recognising explicitly the different capital values, it directs us to appreciating the importance of other capitals in the production of a landscape, which could be overlooked if we just think implicitly about what is the value of a hedge. And I know there's been a piece of work done by John Powell and Peter Gaskell at CCRI that have looked at dry stone walls and looked at multiple values of them. And again, it makes an interesting parallel to draw to compare these results of multiple capital accounting with their results, which I did do in the Little Asby Common report. So that's an update of where we've got to. So I've learnt a lot about trying to think about stocks and flows, trying to apply natural capital tools into multiple capital accounting. So try and move it forward again. But we are really interested to know if anybody's got any more information that they can give us so we can tighten up the methodology. We're particularly interested in reducing the reliance on willingness to pay and all the baggage that it brings with it. We'd like you to spread the word about the tool, because we really do truly believe that if we're going to move forward in society, we have to think about all the values that a landscape brings and not just think about one or two aspects, because landscapes in this country are a culture nature entanglement, and we can never get away from that. So we must value all parts. And people, you can see that people value culture perhaps more than nature, but at the end of the day, it's all relative. And the important thing is that we value everything and not just one aspect. We're also interested if you'd like to run the methodology on your own land, or site, or habitat. We just want to see if we can run the methodology in a different location, try and get ideas from it. And we'd also hope that we could lobby government together to say, hey, multiple capitals, natural capital, really important, multiple capitals, nirvana. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Lois. There doesn't seem to be any questions yet, but if anyone does have any questions, a good time would be now to pop them in the Q&A.
I've blown everybody away.
Learn everybody away, indeed. Christian, if you're there, could I be missing something if I've got the Q&A open, but there's nothing in? Oh, here we go. Good. Thank you very much, Henk. Henk has asked, where does farming fit into the value?
Okay, well, that's really interesting. What part of farming? When we did the Little Asby Common, we looked at commoning specifically because it was part of Little Asby Common. It was it's an active common. So I looked at the financial value of the farm. I looked at the stock. I looked at the commoning, the value of commoning, and the Commoners Association. So it's absolutely crucial that it's fitted into the Little Asby Common one. But of course, house wood is a wood, and therefore there wasn't any farming going on the land, and so therefore farming didn't play a role in the housewood project.
Thanks, Lois. Yeah, we have a few questions coming in now, thick and fast. This one is expressed as a question for Friends of the Lake District. How have we used the values so far? It says produce for the Asby Common example. Jan, are you able to chip in to help with that one? We are still refining the methodology, of course, so we've not done tons with it, I would say, but Jan or Lois.
Okay, thanks, Elise, for your question. So, Little Asby Common, that was the first MCA ever done. So, we've been bearing that in mind as we've been refining it, and perhaps not putting the emphasis on the figures that you might do when you've done another 10. So far we've used that in quite a few ways. We've been using it as part of our policy responses and our campaigning responses, because the value that we pull into Little Asby Common with our agri-environment agreement with the commoners, for example, is absolutely minuscule compared to the value that Lois calculated. So we can tell straight away that there are a lot of benefits for society, but society isn't, if you like, paying back that capital to the people generating it and managing that land for us. So that has been quite important. So we've developed the tool a bit more now, which gives us a little bit more confidence. And what we're now thinking of is, rather than just having something that sits there, is this something that could be developed almost as an opportunity mapping tool? So it'll be much more practical, and Lois may want to pick up on that and where we go on that. So yeah, so far it's just been drip feed for Little Asby and giving us ideas for hows, but more we're thinking now about the future for the whole model and trying to make it more accessible for everybody, not just ourselves. Do you want to chip in, Lois, about what we may be able to do with the model in future?
Absolutely. I think the point that Jan's made about opportunity mapping, one of the things that I've been looking at, I've just published a book in relation to multiple capitals, and specifically in relation to upland agriculture. One of the things I looked at is, well, yes, that's all very well, but what can we actually do with a tool like this? And one of the things I'm interested in is using it as a management tool. And so I developed a toolkit as part of the book that explains how we can actually use it as a management tool. So we know we can get values for different types of capital, But what happens if we focus all our funds on, say, natural capital, or we focus all our funds on human capital? What actually happens? What impacts does it have on other parts of the system? Because as we all know, what you're trying to do in a landscape is often multiple objectives for multiple reasons. And so it's trying to work out a way of helping people think about what the opportunities are if we put money in one part of the system, and what impact it can have across other parts of the system in relation to developing a landscape, building its resilience, and so on and so forth. So there are ways in which we can move it from a passive tool to an active tool, and that's really what I'm interested in looking at, is to develop it as a management tool, and that's what I looked at in my book.
Thanks both. I'm gonna group the other questions that we've got up at the moment into ones that are about the methodology, and then there's some that are slightly more about the application. So have we tested that there is no double counting between the different types of capital? This is from Brenda Dorpillen.
Well, hopefully the way that I devised the methodology, that it did stop that happening, that things didn't bleed through from one to the other. And I think my reasoning behind that, the way I worked it, was to specifically make sure that the sorts of capital attributes, the bits of each capital they looked at, were very disparate. So it's an interesting thing, but I don't believe there is as massive a bleed through as everybody thinks there could be. But I'm going to say that because it is obviously my methodology that I've developed. But I was very cognizant and aware of that there shouldn't be bleed through from one type of one value to the next. And I'd like to think again that I've managed to accomplish that by using different types of tools and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Are we aware, so asks Eleanor Kingston, are we aware of the work currently being done by the University of Exeter, National Trust, Forestry and Forestry England on cultural and heritage capital?
Yeah, I am aware of that, but obviously they're still doing it, so there's no data to access, and there's no tools or anything at the moment to bleed through, because they're still working on it. But thank you.
Question that says primarily for you, Lois, but also for friends as the client, from Alice. From the second assessment, so we learned quite a bit in the first assessment that we then applied when we did the Housewood one, and we're being asked now from the second assessment, what have we learned that we might do differently if we were to do a third?
I think the biggest thing is that I still would love to get rid of the willingness to pay element, but if the tools aren't there, or I can't find them, then we can't eliminate that bit. And that's where, we're reaching out to all you guys out there, is to say, have you got tools that you're developing or you want to try to get financial value, and that I'd be really keen on. That would be the thing that I would want to eliminate, because the willingness to pay does get a bad press, and it is quite crude in many ways, but it fills gaps that we currently don't have ideas for, unless you know of something that we haven't got.
Yeah, and linked to that, we've been asked as well by Nick Mullins if we were, well, as we've said, we are looking for potentially other people to undertake the methodology on other sites or different habitats. Have we got a particular site or particular size or area in mind?
No, I suppose, being completely honest, I think the whole valley would be a bit of a push at this point. Many thousands of hectares. But again, part of the reason, it depends on the quality of the data that comes forward. If there's lots of data for a site, it makes the whole process a lot easier. And then, a willingness to pay exercise is a visitor survey in effect. So being able to use volunteers or volunteer forces to collect the data would be a way forward if it was a big area. But any type of habitat, any type of mixed habitat, integrated habitat, particular farm, cluster of farms, absolutely, we're up for anything, because we want to try it. We want to try it. The more you try it, the more you work out and refine it and get it better to be able to be a useful tool. I want it to be useful. I don't want it to just sit on the shelf and people go, that's lovely.
Yeah, that leads us nicely on to a couple of the other questions. Our colleague Amanda and Madeline have asked questions around the land use framework and use for the planning system. I'm a planner by trade, if that's the right word, as well, and worked in the local planning system before I joined Friends of the Lake District 7 years ago. And certainly I would really like to see it being used in the assessment of sites for land allocations, but I think we would need to get it much more developed and mainstreamed before we'd have much chance of local authorities, hard pressed local authorities, taking it on as an approach that they will be able to apply to every site that they were looking at through the land allocations process. But equally, I think it would be good if it could get some traction within maybe the development industry, ideally, so that sites, when people were looking for pieces of land, which are the most suitable to develop, can we evaluate these and look at the full value, the total
Yeah,
values of these pieces of
yeah,
land to see where we should be, where's a sensible place to target development and where would actually be more useful for a different type of land use. So I certainly can see it as a tool in that, and then that of course does link to the land use framework. In an ideal world, I would love to see it applied throughout the planning system and throughout the land use framework to really ensure that every piece of land is being fully valued for its full range of values and put to best use. But that might be slightly rose bespectacled of me, but that's the sort of thing I think it would be really useful to start to see, even if it's just maybe the bigger, more strategic sites that local authorities are looking at. That would be really good. Another methodology question from Chris Outlaw. He's noticed that we added the value of stocks to the value of flows to get the total value in the 50-year discounting model. How confident are you in this approach? In theory, the value of a stock is equal to the value of the flows, so adding the value of a stock to the value of the flows might be a form of double counting.
that's a really interesting question. I don't know. I just had a go, see what would happen. It was literally, let's have a go and see what we can do, because obviously the whole stock and flow issue, it is complicated enough as itself. I know there are people in government that are interested in just funding stocks and having private sector management of flows and money coming in to manage flows from the private sector. So I, again, because it's not a technique that's been used in other capitals, I am kite flying here. I'm just trying something to see what happens. So I don't think I can fully answer your question at the moment, because I haven't explored it enough about how you divide stocks and flows and what goes on in the system.
And I suppose then that's one of the reasons why we would like to trial it further
Yeah,
on
exactly.
different sites,
Yeah.
different habitats, different sizes and scales, different locations of site, to start to really drill down into some of these finer detailed points, really. Just one more open question at the moment. A thank you. It starts with Nina starts with, thank you, Lois. Have you had much engagement with your work from local or regional policymakers?
No, that's Friends of the Lake District. We've been talking to the Lake District National Park. We've been talking to other people within the Cumbrian area, pushing. But of course, there are so many agendas at the moment. I think also it's so different and so new. I think people are still trying to wrap their head around it. A lot of people are still struggling with natural capital accounting. And then I'm asking them to take on another load as well. Even the literature globally, there isn't a lot of stuff out there about multiple capitals. So a lot of this stuff is quite groundbreaking, making people think in different ways. And so I think it's quite a challenge for people to think about multiple capitals. But you got to start somewhere.
Yeah, and I think we was one of the reasons we wanted to do the webinar for each of them, isn't it?
Yeah.
Why we've brought people together today, and why we have, certainly in response to the land use framework, as we mentioned earlier, for example, we have been including this as Friends of the Lake District in our responses to different local and national policy consultations, just to, as we find with many things, even if it's just a starting point of drip feeding it to people so that people start to hear about it and they become aware of it, and maybe then become inquisitive about it eventually and start to want to find out more and get involved. Some more questions have come in there while we've been answering that previous question. Adela Leeson says it would be great to have a chat as we, the AHRC, DCMS, ACH Taxonomies project, are doing some work on developing the service flows from culture and heritage. This has taken us into a review of a transdisciplinary literature, including psychology and health. There is a question as a result as to whether seeking non-subjective valuation is the right thing. I think we should be exploring behavioural economic literature to seek ways of improving rather than discounting subjective valuations. We should seek to better understand the marginal values. Happy to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely, Della. Totally agree with you.
And one more, Ajaz Ahmed. No, stocks and flows in this context are not the same. One is a static value, the other is dynamic. Stocks deal with assets and flows deal with the value of services and benefits. Yeah, so I think that's perhaps a slight disagreement with one of the previous questions suggesting that one was representative of the value of the other. But do correct me if I'm wrong there in the question and answer box. Any more questions at all, or comments, or offers of means of rolling this out to the all and sundry? Any bright ideas as to how we can be less reliant on the willingness to pay model? If not, I think we've had a good range of questions there. I think we've probably covered most of the main issues. We've got all those questions answered, but we will be sending out the slides, the recording to all the participants, and do obviously get in touch with us if you think of anything later on that might either be able to help us or if you've got any further questions. And do obviously get in touch in particular as well if you have some land or you have a habitat that you are planning to or would like to run the methodology on. That would be really useful too. But otherwise, I think all that's left to do is to thank everyone again for coming. Thank you, Lois,
Thank you, Lorraine,
for presenting there, and hopefully we'll be running another one soon to set out the progress that we've made in rolling out the methodology, developing the methodology a bit further. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Everybody.